Hey y'all, welcome to the Big Mama Was Wrong podcast. I'm your host Marisha, and here we dive into wellness and growth surrounding mental health and culture. Let's get into it. Hey y'all, it's Marisha. I'm back again for another episode of Big Mama Was Wrong. Today I do have another special guest, Pastor Kirby. Can you introduce yourself and share basically what we're going to really dive into today?
Absolutely. Well, my name is Kirby Anthony. I am a pastor here in Charlotte, North Carolina. I lead a ministry called Queen City Discipleship, which is a ministry which has a focus in urban settings. And essentially our ministry can be wrapped up, if you will, in two halves, as we like to say. You know, we like to exemplify what it truly means to follow Jesus of the Bible, and then invite people to do the same and disciple them and show them how to do the same. I'm also a husband of 25 years, and my wife and I share 3 young adult children, and I'm glad to be here.
Cool. So we're going to hop in. One of the things that, and I think we discussed it briefly, was just I was really excited when I learned what you were doing your dissertation on, and you could speak to that more because I feel like it'll help provide some insight as to what we may be seeing is happening, and then how that relates to, because a lot of times when we talk about the historical context of Blacks, church has been embedded in Black history for a long time. And now we're seeing younger generations are not really a fan of church. Some of your research may touch on why we're seeing some of the statistics that we're seeing, and then also provide some solutions as we continue to navigate what it looks like to evangelize and grow our churches. I'll start with asking you, what is the official title of your dissertation?
The official title of my dissertation is Examining the Role of Emotional Intelligence when Leading Predominantly African American Inner City Churches.
Okay, that's pretty specific. How did you determine that was what you wanted to pursue in research?
Well, I'm pursuing a PhD, which is different than a doctorate. And as one of my professors explained to me, a PhD is different because it is essentially adding new information to a body of knowledge that's already there. And so as I was going through my coursework in about the second year, and I'm scheduled to graduate in May of 2024, we had to begin to think about what we wanted to write about. And so we had to begin to think about what subject that you want to, what body of knowledge do you want to research and then add new knowledge to. And so as a pastor, well, first I'll say as someone from the inner city, being born and raised in New York, and then as a pastor and as a shepherd, I wanted to deal with mental health, which is something that in my own family, my family of origin, we dealt with. And I wanted to speak to that. And so as I began to deal with what topic I wanted to do first, I just thought about mental health. And let me also say, so my degree is titled a PhD in leadership, but then we had to have a specific concentration or a specific subject or lane that we wanted to apply that leadership to. And so as a pastor, as a church leader, I wanted to speak to the church or the inner city church, and more particularly, not necessarily, I didn't start off saying that I wanted to just do something for what we call the Black church or the Black room of the church. And let me just say, it's the church, right? But we also know that there are certain challenges that Black Christians, and particularly those in inner city contexts, have to go through, and church leaders in those inner city contexts. Someone who has a church or a ministry or serves or volunteers or works at an inner city church is going to more than likely deal with some different issues than someone who has a church in a rural area or a suburban area. So anyway, I started off, and my first topic was mental health. I told my professor, well, I want to, talk about the Black church and mental health. And he told me, he said, that's too broad of a subject, and there's already a lot of research on that. What are you going to particularly talk about where there isn't a lot of research that you can add to that body of knowledge? And I was like, wow, okay. And so then I narrowed it down to Black men's mental health and the inner city church. And, during this time, my professors never told me not to or didn't give me the green light, he would just say, is there research already in that area? And if there is, what new research can you add to that area? And so as I began to dig through that, I was like, man, there's a lot of stuff out there already about Black men's mental health and the church and all that. And so then let me just keep it real. I just pray. I was like, Lord, what is it? What area? And I thought about a book that I read about 10 to 15 years ago by a pastor in Queens, New York named Peter Scazzaro. And the name of the book was The Emotionally Healthy Church. And I just thought about that book. It just literally popped in my head, which I have the book in my own personal library. And that book was a book that radically transformed my walk with Christ, because it pointed out and highlighted the need for an intentionality in developing my inner emotional life. So once I thought about that book, and I was like, man, wait a minute. And so then I started to think about the Black church and how there isn't, not just the Black church, but in the Black community, there isn't always a great emphasis on therapy. There isn't always an emphasis on getting help for the emotional side, and etc. So I came to that crossroads and I told my professor, and he's like, there you go, Mr. Anthony. That's a great subject because nobody has really written on it. Emotional intelligence it's not a new phenomenon, and I didn't know about it until I started to do the research. It's really been talked about for what I could find, maybe about 60 years or so. But around the 90s, there began to be more writing and research done on it. And so it's fairly new, and especially when it comes to churches and leadership, it's a new area of study in how emotional intelligence and leadership intersect. So hope I wasn't too long-winded for you, but that's how I got to that. That's how I got to it.
No, I'm following. What findings so far as you're doing the process, what has stood out to you the most as a leader, as a pastor, and as an African American? So first I should ask, do you identify as an African American?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely, yes.
So I don't. I identify as Black.
Okay.
All right, so that's why I was, trying to be correct. I'm like, let me make sure I identify as that. But yeah, so as an African American, as a leader, and as a pastor, what have been the most significant findings that you've had so far?
As I go into that, can I read my research questions for you to kind of help, what my findings have been? These are the 3 research questions that I'm asking in my research. The first one is, and let me just back up and say, I identify as Black as well. Okay. So let me say that. But my research questions are, what is the relationship between the emotional intelligence of leaders in predominantly African American churches and their effectiveness in addressing the unique challenges faced by their congregations? The second one is, given the unique challenges faced by leaders in predominantly African American churches, in predominantly African American inner city churches, how can the development of emotional intelligence specifically benefit their leadership practices and the communities they serve? And 3, what are the key components of emotional intelligence that are most influential in facilitating effective leadership in predominantly African American churches operating in inner city contexts? Those are the 3 research questions that I'm asking in my research. And to get answers, to answer those questions, I've been doing a ton of interviews, which have 3 specific questions. And then I've also been doing or passing out emotional intelligence surveys. And so as I've been doing my research, one of the things that has stood out the most is the lack of understanding, perhaps, of the need for emotional intelligence.
So can we pause just a second? I'm sorry.
Sure.
Can you explain what emotional intelligence is? How would you explain emotional intelligence?
So first, if you don't mind, I'd like to read 2 definitions.
Okay.
Can I read two definitions?
Sure.
All right. So one definition of emotional intelligence is this: the knowledge one uses to process and pinpoint the plethora of emotions taking place internally, effectively controlling those emotions, and developing the skill of handling feelings to inspire oneself to achievement. That's one. And then another one is a group of skills that are acquired as one cultivates their ability to discern, comprehend, organize, and manage emotions. As I've been doing this research, I'm finding that emotional intelligence, like I said, it's an essentially new research field, and the definitions can vary. But this is the one common thread that I've seen through it all. Emotional intelligence can be basically summed up in this right here: knowing and understanding what makes you tick, what inspires you, what deflates you, what helps you to go, so to speak, to achieve goals, to get through the day, and then also understanding the emotions when it comes to leadership in those of others, understanding the emotional components in other people. So understanding what makes other people tick, understanding what drives other people or what deflates other people, and how to navigate those roads in order to achieve a common goal, if that makes sense.
I think it makes sense. I feel like essentially what you're saying is understanding your own emotions, being able to process them, and then being able to, because you understand emotions and how they work, also being able to understand the emotions and the behaviors that you see from other people.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. The only thing I would add is that when leadership is involved, because I can understand the emotions of my neighbor and we can just see each other. They don't have anything. I mean, neighborly, but if I don't have to lead them per se, but when you're in a leadership position, it's a step further than just understanding, because I can understand why you're mad. I can understand why you're upset. I can understand why you're offended by what another coworker said. I can understand why you're upset about the protests that are taking place. But now that I understand that, how do I navigate it to get you to fulfill this objective? You know what I'm saying? In a leadership role. And so that's, yes, absolutely. What was your other question? You asked me to explain what EI was.
That was it. What it was before you went into like furthering with the research questions and providing what your findings were from 3 different scopes. Because I just want to make sure that we can follow the entire time.
Yes, ma'am. As I was saying, yes, one of the things that I'm finding is there seems to be a lack of understanding about how important emotional intelligence is, especially in the 21st century, because the inner city Black church, one of the things that it's dealing with is the influx of diversity in the communities. Now, inner cities have always been diverse, but in the 21st century, especially with the flow of immigrants into the country, and also with gentrification, with immigration and all this stuff going on. So now the Black church in the inner city, in these communities, now they have communities that are very diverse. And if the church is to continue its influence and continue to grow and have a voice in these communities and have a voice in the city, we have to know how to deal with our neighbors. We have to know how to invite people in that may not look like us. We have to know how to be loving neighbors, like Jesus said, love your neighbor. And so as I've been doing my research, one of the things that sticks out is there isn't always a sense of urgency that, we really need to embrace this idea of what emotional intelligence is and how it will help us to maintain our influence going forward. That's one of the things that I'm finding. Another thing that I'm finding is as it relates to church leadership, when ministerial leaders and church leaders they go to college, seminaries, and they get training, or even if they're a lot of times, especially in non-denominational churches, the leaders in the church, they didn't necessarily go to seminary. They came to the church, they began to work, and they showed themselves faithful, and then they're elevated to a position of authority and leadership in the church. And then they may go to a Bible college or get some Bible classes that might even be held at the church, or there might be a seminary that they'll begin to go to as an adult. Well, most of these classes, most of them have not taken an emotional leadership class. There are classes on church history. There are classes on their denominational history. There'll be budgeting classes. There are even classes on urban government, and how to, work in urban government and work with city officials and etc. But there is no emphasis or training when it comes to emotional intelligence. And this is what plays out because of that. A lot of times you have ministers, you have leaders who are burnt out, who are trying to grow the church and get more people in. And they're super busy. They got a bunch of programs that they're trying to start or lead or get, facilitate and get other people to lead. They have to prepare for a sermon and Bible study. They have to counsel people in inner cities, people that are coming in that are homeless, on drugs, the mothers that are dealing with juvenile delinquency from their kids. They're dealing with gangbanging. They're dealing with all this stuff. And the pastor is not prepared, and a lot of times because they haven't been trained in this area. They haven't been trained on how to care for themselves. They haven't been trained on how to take time off. They haven't been trained on how to take a Sabbath or to work a Sabbath into their regular schedule. It's all about how to preach, how to put a sermon together, how to start a program, how to get your Sunday school program off the ground and all these other things. And so that's one of the big things that we're finding. And I spoke with a gentleman who's been pastoring for about 40 years. He's a bishop. He leads multiple churches. And he also teaches at a seminary. He's an adjunct professor at a seminary. And one of the things that he said was, Kirby, this research is so needed. And he said, but how do we get it into the seminaries? What he said was, your research will show that we need to make it an emphasis in seminaries. Like, we need to teach these incoming pastors how to make emotional intelligence a priority so that they can last, so that they can pastor for 20 years without a scandal, so that they can, pastor healthily and have a good home and a good marriage and not burn out because they're trying to juggle all these things, because perhaps the community is looking to them and they don't know how to manage and take time off and all that. So those are two of the things that I'm seeing and uncovering already.
So it's interesting to me. Whenever I was asking, I didn't, even once we begun to discuss this, I did not consider past the emotional intelligence of pastors as it relates to themselves as leaders. I considered it, and perhaps because I'm a lay member, I considered it as the emotional intelligence as it relates to disciples. So it's interesting that what you're doing is starting or considering not necessarily a hierarchy, but a structure in which, if they are able to identify what their emotional needs are, strengths, weaknesses, whatever it is, if they're able to establish emotional intelligence with themselves, then theoretically it will benefit the church, not just because they'll be able to avoid scandal or because they'll be able to have healthy relationships, but as leaders, people like myself tend to admire, to observe, and to follow, maybe not, foot for foot, so to speak, but at least pattern some of the things that we see our leaders do that prove to be effective. So where my perspective was like learning emotional intelligence so that you could teach it to your congregation or relate to congregations better, yours is actually the opposite end of the spectrum, where it's more so learning for themselves. And in turn, the fact that they know for themselves, we can expect a positive impact for congregations. So that's dope.
Yes, ma'am. And thank you for that. And, the idea was that it begins with us. Mm-hmm. It begins with the leader. I have to be healthy. I have to be an example. One of the things, I mentioned earlier that the driving forces behind me wanting to write in this area was because of a book that was suggested to me, Emotionally Healthy Church by Peter Scazzaro. who was a pastor in Queens, New York. He actually retired, and now him and his wife, they have a parachurch ministry where they deal with emotional intelligence and church leaders. And one of the reasons that that book was so instrumental and just so impactful to me was because I was at a time when I was just feeling so burnt out and just, running in 1,000 circles. And then also at that time in my life, I had suffered the murder of my younger brother. He had got murdered. He was murdered 20 years ago, this past July. And that was a huge wake up call. It caused me to, I dealt with grief. I was dealing with anger. I was dealing with all these emotions on the inside, crying and just like, Lord, what's going on? I just couldn't get myself together. And I couldn't fast it away. I couldn't declare it away. I couldn't, quote scriptures and have it go away. I had to find a holistic way to deal with God, what's going on inside of me. And someone has suggested that book to me, which caused me to turn inward and began to look at what was on the inside of me. But as I began to read the book, I began to see how, man, in our churches, I'm not the only one. I'm not the only one that operates like this. I'm not the only leader. I see it all the time. We kind of think that, and if I could just say this, maybe about 10 years ago, I was doing some research on the focus of churches, and I read this one gentleman's findings where he said up until about, I think he said 100 years ago, up until about 100 years ago, the focus of the church was caring for the flock. That was the focus. Like, let's care for people. Let's disciple people. He said, but around 100 years ago, it began to be growth. We got to get more. We have to get more people, not necessarily make disciples, but we have to get more people. We have to grow our
the membership.
And yes, membership. Exactly. And he just talked about how as that change happens, some unhealthy things crept into the church. Right. And so now you have pastors that are, they will drive themselves to an early grave, trying to do so many things when maybe God didn't call them to do that. And then you add in our American culture, which I'm American. Okay, I'm not dissing American culture. I'm a retired military, so I know our country has a lot of things that I hate about it, that I don't like about it, but I still think that we have the greatest country on earth. That's my personal feelings. But there's so much about our culture that I don't like. And one of the things is this ambitious drive. You got to do it. You can do whatever you want. Go, 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 go. And see, man, when that thing creeps into the church, and then you have church leaders starting to push behind that thing, and it's all about numerical growth and all about numbers. And if you don't have this many members, then you ain't doing it right. And, somebody that's pastoring with this many people, oh, let's get them. Let's hear what they have to say. Let's do whatever. And look, I'm not knocking all that. I love the church. Christ called me to be a shepherd in his church. I love the church, and I know Jesus still loves his church, and I still love the church. But there are so many things that I feel like we do wrong. And I think that sometimes, we don't focus on our own health, our own emotional health as church leaders, because we're trying to, be more like the culture than more like maybe what the Bible has called us to be. And so that might be another topic, but I just threw that out there.
I understand. So what I'm getting from what you're saying is basically like being the best version of yourself. But it's like from a pastoral mindset, understanding the needs that you have and addressing those needs. And there's basically no shame in it. Because I believe sometimes, and it may not necessarily be the case across the board, I don't know that leaders always have safe spaces. Because they're ministering to other people, but they may not necessarily have the safe spaces, the friendships, the support, the mentorship that they could use or benefit from in their own positions. So I would say at minimum, at least having the emotional intelligence, like, you know what, I am not feeling myself. What's next? Versus like just cramming everything inside or suppressing everything or feeling like you can't talk about it. So that makes a lot of sense. I see where you're going with it. What are you looking for? I know you're looking forward to the most to graduating, but aside from that, what are you looking forward to the most in your research process? It's like, is it an aha moment or is it it's what I thought? Is it a application? What are you looking forward to the most?
Absolutely. I would answer that question by saying, I think that my biggest desire is bringing forth research that will help future inner city Black church leaders to apply this research and the findings and then create a change that will open the door to true biblical discipleship. That would be my biggest desire, to create something that and let me back up and say this. The more research I do, the more pastors that I find that are saying, yes, yes, I want this, I need this, our churches need this. I spoke with a pastor here in Charlotte who pastors, well, I don't know what his membership may be, but I know they have a huge campus. I mean, they have a huge campus. I don't know if I'll say it's one of the largest churches in Charlotte, but it is certainly one of the oldest, and they have a beautiful campus. Okay. And I spoke in his church this past summer, and him and I are friends. We had a conversation, and he was just sharing with me some of the challenges that him and his wife were having and how they have had conversations about, maybe next steps, but they're considering, leaving, right? And we're having this conversation. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, dude, like, you have this church, you have these people behind you, have this different things going on. You can really impact the city, and they're just not, all the way happy because of some things. And as him and I talk some emotional intelligence stuff, and, maybe feeling so busy and feeling like this isn't happening and that isn't happening. And I'm like, Lord, what would it be like? Because look, Marisha, I really believe that church is changing. And what I mean by that is churches have to change, not the message. Okay. The message will always be Jesus Christ and him crucified, but the method, because as you stated at the beginning of this broadcast, the younger millennials, Gen Z, and I think it's the Gen A now, or what, the Alpha
I think
generation.
they're alpha, yeah.
Alpha generation. They're not feeling church. They're not. They're not feeling it. Maybe like how I felt it. And I came to Christ. I wasn't raised in the church. I came to Christ as a young man. But I'm just saying that I feel like church has to look at her methods and say, are we really making disciples? Or are we just continuing to have a good time and just, us four and no more kind of mentality? And are our churches really growing, or are people just joining from other churches when something happens at this church? And I just really feel like this is one of the areas that church leaders have to stop and say, okay, yes, we do want our congregations to be healthy, but let's look at ourselves and see what changes we have to make. Because you know this. I mean, you have eyes and ears and social media. You see all the stuff going on, all the scandals. People have lost so much hope in church. And here's a little rabbit trail. I personally believe that's one of the reasons that there has been such an uprising in, this exodus of millennials, the younger millennials and Gen Z and Generation Alpha. They ain't even coming to church anyway. But there's so many younger Black individuals leaving the church and going after Kemet and the conscious movement and the Black Hebrew Israelite movement, which every time you turn around, there's a new IG page or new whatever, these guys popping up and everything and speaking to some issues. And they're able to say, hey, look at that church. Look at what's going on over there. Is that what you want? Is that what it's about? Look at what the pastor is doing. Look at these stories that you're hearing. No, you need to come over here and follow this. And so, all of this has a purpose. And I really feel like this is going to be a piece of the puzzle to the research to help future church leaders to say, hey, wait a minute. Let's look at how we're doing things. Do we have to have the biggest church in the city, or do we have to do this, or do we have to have 20 outreach ministries? We feeding babies, we got the young people, we doing the singles, we doing this. What if we just maybe had two really good things that we focused on, and then we took resources and poured into our brothers and sisters on the other side of town that are really good over there? Do we really have to, we losing all our young people, so we got to do this and change and all that? Okay, well, maybe you just have an aging congregation, brother and sister, pour into those seniors and bless those seniors, and maybe take some of these resources and pour into another church, or maybe an upstart or a young church on the other side of town that is doing it right with younger people, and pour into them. Where have we gotten this idea that we got to be everything and do everything and be big and flashy? And that's what I'm hoping that my research will help to spark a change, in some of our leaders and our leaders of the future.
Okay. So one of the things that I wanted to ask, because I know that a part of your research focuses on inner city.
Yes.
So I did not grow up in the inner city. I grew up in the country. So sometimes I know that we can find things and say, okay, you know what? It's also applicable here, or it's applicable there. Or if we tweak this a little bit, then we can try it out here or there. Is there anything that you found in your research that may not necessarily be specific to inner? I know that it has to be specific to inner city, but it could also be applicable to churches or leadership that are not in the inner city.
Absolutely. And, the truth is that emotional intelligence is for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, all of the components are for everybody. You know why I made it, or why I focused on the inner city? Two reasons. One is because I was born and raised in the inner city, and there are just certain challenges just by the sheer volume of people living, on top of one another, so to speak, in inner cities that churches in rural areas or suburban areas don't deal with. But then number two, my professor kept saying, it's too broad. You have to narrow it. It's too broad. You have to narrow it. So I was like, all right, well, what about the inner city? There you go, Kirby. There's not a lot of research with emotional intelligence and leadership in the inner city. And so that's what I focus on. But, as I've been interviewing different pastors, I interviewed one pastor in California, San Jose, California. He's an African-American pastor out there. We were talking, and he just kept saying, well, this is not just for the inner city, right? This is not just for the inner city, right? This is not just for the Black church in the inner city. I was like, I know, Pastor, but, I'm just focusing. I'm just narrowing in on the subject. So absolutely, because we all need to be healthy. We all need to, as 3 John 2 says, beloved, I pray that in all respects you may prosper and be in good health, just as your soul prospers. We all, no matter what, complexion, age, where the church is, you need to have inner health, right? But the inner cities have certain dynamics. Inner city church leaders are facing certain dynamics that maybe some rural and, like I said, suburban churches don't face. For example, homelessness, the unemployment rate, juvenile delinquency, gang banging, diversity, these diversity issues. I mean, cities are becoming more and more diverse. And so part of the thought was a pastor in a Black church in the inner city that has multiple ethnic groups around the church who's dealing with, gang banging. There's, different gangs going on in the neighborhood. And then he's dealing with, drug addiction, that affects the church and around the church. There are certain components of emotional intelligence that he or she has to really walk in, has to really be intentional about developing. Then per se, the pastor who's out in a rural area, maybe they have 100 people, maybe they're not dealing with diversity issues, they're not dealing with drugs, they're not dealing with certain things like the inner city church. And so The answer is yes. Inner city is for everybody. Or I'm sorry, emotional intelligence is for every church leader. But I am specifically trying to target. If you are an inner city Black church leader, these are some things that you have to be prepared to work with, and this is how you prepare. Like, for example, the strained relationship between inner city African Americans and Blacks and law enforcement. Okay, if you are a Black church, or if you are a Black church leader in the inner city, you're going and you have a pretty decent sized congregation, then you are likely going to have to deal with that dynamic to some degree. Okay, to some degree, more than your counterpart that's in the suburbs or that's in the rural areas. And so, how do we prepare for that? How do we prepare these new church leaders to deal with that?
So, and this is not a term that I agree with necessarily, but I know a lot of people are familiar with the term church hurt.
Yes.
Okay. Church hurt. How do you feel like emotional intelligence can impact that? And again, I'm not saying that I know that sometimes people can't attend churches, and as a result of being a part of ministries, they can be hurt, but I'm not, so I don't negate that.
Yes.
It's just the fact that people don't say stuff like work hurt or like, other systems. For whatever reason, they tend to focus on it whenever they're part of a church community. But in using the term, because that's what people have labeled it, do you feel like your research, do you feel like what you're finding, that there's any relationship, whether good or bad or indifferent, can improve it or relates to it?
Yes, ma'am. That's a very good question. I think that this research can definitely help to alleviate it. And here's why. And I like to answer this in two ways. First, absolutely, because when you look at church hurt, okay, and people get hurt in church for a variety of reasons. Certainly, we have it's like a spectrum, okay? So over here on this part of the spectrum, somebody got hurt because, my wife and I actually, a young lady spoke with my wife. This didn't happen at our church, but a young lady told my wife how that at a church she was at, she left. Part of the reason she left is because her and her husband were told that they could have a certain reserved seating at the front of the church, and somebody kept taking the seats. And when she went to leadership, she was kind of brushed off. And so that just rocked their world, right? So I'm like, come on now, for real? Like, is that what we're doing? So that's kind of like the grow up and get it together. All the way over to the other side of the spectrum where you have, different types of abuses that have taken place. Church leaders have stolen money and just did people wrong. And, you can just look at the news or watch social media and see all the stories that's going on because of that. And so people get, hurt in churches and they'll throw that term out there very fast. Oh, church hurt, church hurt, church hurt. But I do think that somewhere along that spectrum, there is a place where church leaders can alleviate some of it just by the way they lead and just by the way they manage, and they lead and they manage out of who they are. And so perhaps if they were to look at themselves and recognize, I'll use a rubber meets the road example, right? So churches are trying to be the biggest and the best and the brightest. They just it's driven by numbers. A lot of churches, and part of it is because they have to bring in money to pay, these mortgages and pay for all these buildings, these brick and mortar buildings that they have. And so if you have a philosophy of ministry where it's just numbers, and I've heard people try to spiritualize it. Oh, we just want to get one more person. Jesus just wants you to get one more person. You need to invite 10 people so just one more person will come in. And I get it, Pastor. I get it, man. I know. I understand. I've been in pastoral ministry for a long time. I know you got to pay for the square footage and all that other kind of stuff. But it's like I've found that when you have a philosophy of ministry that somewhere along the lines is rooted in numbers, then you lead differently, you manage differently. There's such a temptation to not be people focused and to more so be paper focused. And somewhere along the line, someone's going to get hurt. Look, you can have, can I tell you a story, a personal story? Can I share a testimony?
Certainly.
Okay. It's not this, maybe not be a testimony, but okay. So one time in our church, this happened, this was a long time ago, but there was a lady that came to our church. And let me preface it by saying this. Sometimes, pastor, church leader, I just want to encourage you, because sometimes no matter what you do, somebody's going to get hurt and leave. Somebody's going to be, pastors can sometimes, church leaders, not just pastors, we are sometimes anybody in any type of leadership, okay? I'll even broaden it, not just in church, but we are sometimes some of the most misunderstood people. If you're doing any type of leading, whether it's in the church, on the job, in the community, somebody's going to misunderstand you. So we had this one sister come to our church, and she went through a membership class on a Saturday. And I remember after the membership class, they were doing some window tinting at the front of our church at the glass, and I stuck around and helped. I was just helping peel off the old tint and put some tint up on the windows. And my wife was with me, so she stuck around. So this sister had stuck around with her. And it was about 2 hours, and they just had a good conversation. I'd walk by, they'd be laughing and talking and all that other kind of stuff. Now, I forgot to add this part. So when they went through the membership class, one of the things that I said, hey, tomorrow when we introduce you to the church, I was telling the group this, I'll ask you to stand up and to come forward. You'll turn around and face the congregation. We'll welcome you officially into the church body. And then I'll ask you if you want to say anything on the microphone. You don't have to say anything, but if you like to, you're welcome to. Just keep it short. So everybody was like, okay. But this one particular lady said, Pastor, I don't think I would want to do that. So I was thinking she was saying, I don't want to speak on the microphone. Right? I don't want to say anything. So I said, okay, sister, no problem. Go. I'm helping with the window tint. And, I brought that out because she stayed back 2 hours speaking to my wife, just laughing. They having a good time, whatever. Next day comes. We get to the part of the service where I say, hello, church. We have some new members, whatever. So I said, I'm going to ask our members to stand. So they stood up. And I remember my eyes met her eyes, and she just had this very look like, but her eyes got real big. So I was like, okay, what am I doing wrong? Like, what did I say? So then I said, well, I'm going to ask y'all to come forward and just turn around and share your name and this and that. So they all came up and she said her name, and, the church clapped and they sat down. And so I remember the rest of the sermon, she just sat there with a blank look on her face. So in my head, I said, okay, I did something wrong. I don't know what I did to make her mad, but I'm like, yesterday she was laughing with my wife. Everything was cool. Service was over. She got up, beelined out the door, right? So I knew she was upset about something, but I didn't know. But I was like, well, I didn't do anything. I didn't say anything. So I called another sister in the church, and a leader. I said, hey, can you, that sister, can you get her information and just call her and just check on her? So she called her, and she told this lady, I was so embarrassed. I told Pastor Kirby that I have a stuttering problem and that I didn't want to get up and say anything in front of the church. Right? So I'm like, no, she didn't. I would have remembered that. Like, if she would have said that, I would have remembered that and said, okay, but still, I remember I was like, I still told them you don't have to say anything. But I specifically don't remember hearing her say I have a stuttering problem. But I'm thinking to myself, easy fix, sis. You're new to the church. It's an easy problem. She told this lady, I ain't never coming back to that church. The pastor embarrassed me. So I was really hurt by that thing, Marisha. And I'm a little young pastor. I'm like, oh God, I'm messing up already. I had to really understand. Someone shared this with me. Someone older shared this with me. Kirby, there are some people that have some issues, and you're just the one that rubbed up against the scab. Like you were just the one that they were already carrying stuff, and you just rubbed up against the scab. And now they're going to go and tell the story about how they were hurt in the church and Pastor Kirby did this and all that. But you know what, son? Great is your reward in heaven. And I remember that thing just encouraged me. I was like, yeah, Lord, because I really felt bad about that. And I had to realize, like, look, there are instances of church hurt where, like I said, people have really gone through some things. They've been abused, they've been lied on, they've been betrayed, their secrets have been exposed. Yes, that's different than somebody that there was a little misunderstanding. I know I told that little story, and thank you for helping me to get that out. That ministered to me, you know what I'm saying? Just
Mm.
helping to share it. But I'll say this, like I mentioned, yes, this will help that area because there is a segment on that spectrum of church hurt where if church leaders could just lead better, could just turn inward better and understand what Christ desires, then we could maybe tweak our philosophies of ministry and our leadership style. And then so many people wouldn't get hurt because we're trying to build this huge edifice and brand our ministry and be something that the culture is driving instead of the Holy Spirit. So yes, I do think that it will help.
That's cool. Okay. So I'm excited for you. I do again want to thank you for coming and sharing everything that you shared, dropping gems along the way. I appreciate it and I appreciate you. This is your moment for your shameless plug. Let people know where you are, how they can find you on social media. If there's anything that you want to mention that they can get access to, this is the seconds of thing.
Thank you. Well, you can follow me on Facebook. Just look up Kirby Anthony. We also have a church. Our church's Facebook page is Queen City Discipleship. And we also have a ministry for men that we started about 3 months ago that I'm very excited about. It's called the Kind Warrior Mission. The Kind Warrior Mission. That's on Facebook and Instagram. The Kind Warrior Mission is our attempt to reach men virtually. And so everything is done virtually. You sign up and we stay in contact through an app called Group Me. People always say, where did you get the name from? Well, I was raised by my grandfather. We cared for him in our home for the last 4 years of his life. He died on May 4th, 2022 at the ripe old age of 97. He was my dad figure growing up, and I can remember I was a bad child, and I got into so much trouble, but he always had a lot of faith in me, and he would always say, Kirby, you're going to be something. Kirby, you're going to do this, you're going to do that. And when I went into the military, he was just so proud of me and just always encouraging me throughout my whole life. When he died, my son came up to me and said, Dad, Granddad was strong, but he was so loving. He was a kind warrior. And that thing just stuck with me. It's just like, wow, it resonated with me. And so we have the Kind Warrior Mission. If you are a man out there and you're just looking for brothers to connect with, that you can stay connected with daily through an app. We pray together. We can post prayer requests. We encourage each other through scripture. Sometimes I'll put a teaching up there. You can find the Kind Warrior Mission on Instagram and Facebook. If you want to follow me on Instagram, my IG is Kirb Encourages, KIRB Encourages. And I'll just tell you, I like to laugh. And so I just post, it ain't just a bunch of scriptures and stuff. I like to laugh. And so I post all kinds of things on there, good, clean stuff, but it'll make you laugh on my IG page, Kirb Encourages. And also one last, KirbyAnthony.com. You can go to my own personal website, KirbyAnthony.com. That's KIRBY, Anthony, ANTHONY.com. That'll give you more information about what's going on in my life. Our church's website, which is QCDFam, stands for Queen City Discipleship Fam.org. It's down right now. We're updating it and getting it ready for the new year. And so that's not quite ready yet, but it'll be ready soon.
Thank you. Do you have any final words or any lasting impressions that you want to leave for the listeners?
I just want to encourage individuals who are discouraged and just maybe struggling and trying to find their place in the purpose of God for their lives. I want to encourage you, and I want to not just encourage you with the words of Christ, where he said in Matthew 11, come unto me, all who are weary, and I will give you rest. Jesus calls us to come to him to give us rest. But I also want to encourage you to be intentional about finding out what's going on the inside, and getting help, seeking out help. I heard someone share this quote in 2023. It was so powerful earlier this year. And the young pastor said, sometimes we struggle because we're trying to fast away something that we need therapy for. And that thing just was like, it was like, oh my Lord, this is so key for my people. And I just want to encourage you. Sometimes we feel like God doesn't love me. I'm struggling. This thing is too heavy. The devil has got a hold of me. Maybe you just need to just go and sit down and get some therapy and sit with someone that's trained in an area that can help you figure out what's going on. I want to encourage you to do that for 2024. And God loves you. Never despair in the love of God, because as long as you have breath in your body, Jesus can move on your behalf. And so I hope that encourages you.
So thank you, Pastor Kirby. I appreciate it. I appreciate you again. Thank y'all for listening. Have a great afternoon, great morning, whatever time it is that you're listening to this podcast.